when you, or if you are elected, what would your first priority be, and what would your first 90 days look like in office?
Okay. I like the way you start phrasing that when you said when I am elected. On January 2nd, I would call the legislature in, and they can't formally start until a little bit later in the month. But I would present them with my plan to reform Michigan's tax structure, which, as I told you, would start with an immediate cut of the Michigan business tax in half, as well as a rollback of the income tax hikes of 2007 that every Michigan voter had to encounter. And quite frankly, Bob, this plan right here outlines the first 90 days, 92 ideas for 90 days. You know, it's about building the right team. It's about changing the culture, putting people in place who want to work with you, not against you. But number one, and the centerpiece, would be the tax cut, because that will drive reform. That will drive everything else that happens.
The next question, which several of the cards are related to this question, and I think it is often referenced when looking at some of the perception studies you mentioned about Michigan's competitiveness.
Right.
And that is the right to work question. Do you support right to work?
Well, I was asked, we had a debate, all the Republican candidates, and we had a debate if the legislature passed a bill, a right to work bill, would you sign it? And I would. But the reality is, if you go to Indiana, you go to Ohio, you go to Wisconsin, you go to Minnesota, they are beating us. We have a 14.6% unemployment rate. The next highest in the Midwest, I believe, is Illinois at like 10.7%. So they are all beating us by 30 to 40 to 50%. And all of them are unionized. As I see it, it's like first things first. Our tax structure is our number one enemy. Long term, we can address other challenges that hold us back from developing further. And part of it, quite frankly, is the public. That would have to be done in a constitutional amendment. And the last time it was done, there's 22 states that have right to work right now. 20 of them did it before 1950. The 21st was Idaho in 1986, and then after that was Oklahoma in 2001. And Oklahoma was surrounded by right to work states, and Oklahoma only had an 11% unionized workforce at the time. We were about double that. So, there's that's something that you'd really have to focus on later on. So would I say that's not in my 90-day plan? And realistically, there'd have to be a lot of conversation, a lot of talk, and it wouldn't be done in a year or two or three or four.
Another economic development related question. Oftentimes the problem that Michigan is referenced as having is having over 2,000 taxing jurisdictions across the state.
Right.
So the whole issue of municipal consolidation and expense cutting there, what's your position and take on that?
Well, the great thing about that, you can get the answer right here. And one of my ideas in here is to change the Uniform Cooperation Act. The Uniform Cooperation Act is something that was put in legislation about 40 years ago. And here's what it does. It's a poison pill to consolidating or sharing services. For instance, if you're in Oakland County and there's Farmington, it sits right in the middle, the city of Farmington sits right in the middle of the township of Farmington Hills. It make a lot of sense for them to share most every service. However, under the Uniform Cooperation Act, if two cities or two municipalities get together, they have to pay the higher wage for any shared service. So if firefighters were making more in Farmington than they were in Farmington Hills, the Farmington Hills firefighters would have to be paid at the higher rate. So you know what happens then? There's no incentive for a merger or consolidation of services. It's in here, I feel like I'm a tarot card reader because I put it in here. It's been something I've been talking about. And yesterday, the Senate actually voted on reforming that act. I haven't read their actual bill and whether it would be a strong amendment or weak amendment. But they're starting to head the right way, and I guarantee you next January they won't just be walking the right way, they will be sprinting the right way.
Next question is related to the gridlock that we've all seen in the state legislature, and so the question is, what is your position on term limits, and would you as governor seek to modify our state's term limit?
You know, I didn't vote for term limits in 1992, and you know, if you look at what happened with the Michigan House just a couple of years ago, you can see that people are capable of changing philosophies and choices. Of course, when they did that, we got the income tax and the new Michigan business tax. But I'm against term limits. I don't like term limits. That being said, it would be something I would address later on, because the reality of the game, and you're going to hear a lot of people talk about, in fact, 2 weeks ago, the governor said she was in favor of a constitutional convention, because as if the Michigan Constitution was a problem for her not getting anything done. You know, I totally disagree with that. In fact, you know, my reply would be simply, you know, Governor, the Constitution isn't the problem. The problem is we need a new governor with a stronger Constitution and backbone. That's what we really need. So, Bob, you know, and you hear people talk about the part-time legislature. I'm kind of, you know, I could live with a part-time legislature. That's all good and fine. But the reality is, the governor is the big kahuna. And you never heard Bill Milliken, or you never heard John Engler, or Jim Blanchard say that, you know, we need to extend term limits, or we need to have a part-time legislature, we need to change the Constitution for me to do my job. And quite frankly, most states, governors don't have the gall to blame their problems on the Constitution.
The next question is related to what many people are projecting as nearly a $2 billion deficit next year in state government, and the fact that government is really built on, our government was designed with 1 million more jobs. I mean, we lost 1 million some odd jobs. What would be your plan to balance the budget for 2011?
Well, you know, you can go to page 38 of my plan here. It's right here. But I'll give you a couple quick and dirty answers, and then a little more philosophical one. Just to give you a sense, in my office, we have 20% less employees than we had in 2000. In fact, we're cutting salaries in my office. You might have read about that in the paper, and we cut salaries. Actually, when I say we're cutting, I've been going to the Civil Service Commission, because I have to get their permission before we can cut salaries, as odd as that is, even despite our budget problems. But I've cut salaries, I've had to lay people off. It's the only one in state government that does that. Like you, I didn't like the idea of having to lay people off, but I know from the friends in my neighborhood, my brother-in-law who's been laid off, that, you know, times have changed in Michigan, and government has to understand that. So we've been making do. In fact, we've been doing better than making do. But our caseload's gone up 10% in the past 3 years, and my staff is still kicking it out every single day because of leadership and cohesion and focus on the mission. And we don't allow whining in my office. And that's what I would bring to all state government. Some of the ideas. If I and the other 50,000 state employees paid had paid the average copay and had the average health care package that is average across the country for public sector employees, it would save you all $270 million. If teachers in Michigan, now it used to be when we had property taxes, the financing of schools was a local matter. But since Proposal A, you know, the state gives schools $13.4 billion last year. And it's actually education is the biggest cost driver, which it should be in our state government. But if our teachers had the same health care packages that the average teacher does across the country, it would save $500 million a year. So we're talking about $770 million right now. If you cap, the only place in Michigan where you can be 22 years old, graduate from Michigan State this year, and go get a job and have a defined benefit plan, The only place is in a school. And so if you kept that defined benefit and put all new teachers on a 401k, that would save $97 million a year.